If you are suffering from depression, one of the things that I have read, one of the things that I have learned about depression is that you really do feel like you're all alone. You can be in a room full of people and be totally alone because of the feelings that you have as a matter of being depressed. You can be really up at one moment and very much down the next. It's just a real roller coaster ride. And it makes it very uncomfortable because it's hard for you to deal with life. When at one moment you're here, the next moment you're down here, and you really don't know what is going to trigger one way or another. We talked about that this morning, looking at Moses and looking at how that in his life, as he led the children of Israel out of Egypt toward the promised land, that Moses indeed became very discouraged, maybe even suffered a certain degree from depression in the sense that he finally got to the point where he told God, just take my life. You know, if this is the way it's going to be, I'd just soon die. This evening we want to continue in our study of dealing with discouragement. And this evening we want to look at another Old Testament man that we are very well familiar with, who was very much like Moses in that he is not a person that you would necessarily think would be discouraged, or certainly not someone that you would think would necessarily suffer from depression. He was a very powerful man, just like Moses was. This evening we want to take a look at the man Elijah. He was perhaps the greatest, or at least one of the greatest Old Testament prophets. Malachi, the last prophet that spoke for God to his people Israel before God engaged in that 400 years of silence to his people, spoke of the coming of John the Baptist, comparing him to the prophet Elijah. Because Elijah was a man that was full of enthusiasm. He was a man that was full of zeal. He was a man that was full of fire. Very much like John the Baptist, as he kind of emulated him. You remember when the Pharisees and the scribes were coming out to John's baptism, and he said, "You brood of vipers, who have warned you to flee from the wrath that is to come." And John wasn't scared to confront and to bring anyone's attention to the fact that they had changes that they needed to be made. And so it was with Elijah. In the 18th chapter of 1 Kings, we read about that great confrontation that Elijah had with Ahab and the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of the Asherah. And as you read 1 Kings chapter 18 and you read that account, how that Elijah came and he challenged the prophets. And he says, let's just see who is the true God of Israel. And you remember the account. How that he told them, you guys, you go ahead and build an altar. We'll have an oxen, and you can choose whichever one of the two oxen that you want. This is not going to be some kind of sleight of hand trick that I'm pulling here. You choose whichever ox that you want. You prepare that oxen. You put it upon the altar, and you call out to Baal, and you call out to your gods, and you ask them to send fire to consume this offering. And he says, I'll do the same thing. I'll call on my God, the true God, the one and only living God, the God of heaven and earth. And we're told how that the prophets of Baal called out and called out and called out, and nothing happened. It got to the point where they were even cutting themselves. So that in doing that, they were hoping that maybe they would invoke the pleasure of Baal and that he would indeed send fire from heaven to destroy the altar and the sacrifice there on the nothing. Absolutely nothing. And then Elijah did the same thing. He prepared an altar. He prepared the wood on it. He rolled it, and he prepared the oxen. And he put the oxen up on the altar, and he had them dig a trench around the altar. And he asked them to put water in it, and they did it a second and even a third time until we're told that the water overflowed. And he soaked the oxen as well. And he called out unto God. He prayed to God. And God sent out a fire from heaven that was of such degree that not only did it consume the burnt offering as far as the oxen that had been prepared, but it destroyed the altar and it blacked up the water that was in the ditch, even the dust around the altar. To where there was absolutely no question whatsoever what or who was the one and only true and living God. And as a result of this incredible demonstration of God's power, the people of Israel repeated, "Lord, He is God, the Lord, He is God." Can you imagine? Can you imagine what Elijah was feeling at that very moment? That God had indeed come down with this fire and consumed this great sacrifice in such a way that the prophets of Baal were clearly exposed as being false prophets. How that Elijah himself had been demonstrated as God's prophet. You might recall in his prayer to God, Elijah asked God to do this partly to show the people that he was sent from God. And then also to show the people who was the one and only true God. And God showed up and God demonstrated His great power. And you cannot help but get the picture that here was Elijah who was so encouraged, so strengthened by that. As a matter of fact, we're told that he had all the prophets of Baal put to death. We'll talk about that in just a moment, a little bit more. What is interesting to me is that this great victory on Mount Carmel that Elijah had enjoyed, as far as God being vindicated, as far as God being shown to be the true God, and he as a prophet of God, on the heels of this wonderful great victory, he had to be just feeling so good that the discouragement and the depression that he very quickly began to feel, just right on the heels of that. Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, "So may the gods do to thee, and even more, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time." And as we see in the record there, immediately there was an entire change in Elijah and in his behavior and in what he did. And we have to wonder, and we have to ask ourselves, how can someone go from such an emotional high, if you will, from having experienced the great power of God and being shown to be a prophet of God, how can he go from being so filled with exhilaration and everything to a point of where, as we will see, he fled from Jezebel? What was Elijah experiencing in all of these things? Well, very much like Moses, Elijah was physically exhausted. We look there in the account. He had to build the altar, and he had to prepare the wood, and he had to prepare the oxen as far as cutting it up and putting it on the altar. The trench was dug, and I don't know whether he dug it or not necessarily, but it seems to be indication in 1 Kings chapter 18 and verse 40 that the 400 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of the Asherah, that Elijah was the one that slew those men himself. Maybe he didn't, but there sure seems to be an indication that he did. I would think that after doing all of those things, that Elijah certainly would be very much exhausted. And here comes along Jezebel threatening his life, and so he leaves that place, and he goes over here to Beersheba, and he leaves his fellow person there, and goes another day's journey to the wilderness, and all of this, I get the impression that he had just used up all the physical energy that he could muster up. I think that it's true that, like Moses, Elijah was emotionally drained here, because we see how that he tells God, "It is enough. This is all I can take," is really what he was saying. I've come to the end of my road. I just don't see any light at the end of the tunnel. And it's all closing in and coming down on me, and this is just as much as I can take. This is all I can handle. It's enough. And I believe that we also see how that, like Moses, Elijah considered death to be preferable to living. He said, Lord, take my life. He was just completely down and out. That's all there can be said. And you know what else? Very much like Moses, I think that Elijah was spiritually defeated as well. And that seems impossible, doesn't it? It did so to me this morning when we were looking at Moses, how that a man of such great faith and such, a man that strong, how he could get to a point to where he just figured it was better to die than to go on. And Elijah did as well. And it seems to me that Elijah, very much like Moses, got to a point to where he was spiritually depleted. And the reason why I say that is because then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, so may the gods do to me, and even more, if I do not take your life as make your life as the life of one of them about tomorrow this time. And he was afraid. He was afraid. And I think that even though there's just those three words that we are emphasizing here, it tells us a great deal of how things had turned for Elijah. Because you remember when we go back to the 18th chapter of the book of Kings, when Elijah came back and he confronted Ahab. And Ahab, in greeting Elijah, he said, is that you troubler of Israel? Now, who is Ahab? He's the king. He's the man that's got really control over life and death throughout the kingdom. He was the man in charge. Very much like the rulers of countries today. You don't necessarily call them into question as far as what they do or even why they do it. And so here came along Ahab, and Elijah saw him, and Ahab said, is that you troubler of Israel? And Elijah returned by saying, I'm not the trouble of Israel, you are. You're the one that has put trouble in Israel with all the various kinds of idolatrous worship that you have introduced among God's people. And very much as I see it, as depicted in the picture here, Elijah is standing toe-to-toe with him, and maybe as in the picture, pointing his finger right in his face and saying, I'm not the one who's causing all the trouble among God's people, you are. I know this, that the picture of Elijah as he confronts Ahab is the Elijah that we pretty much think about as far as this fire and brimstone kind of guy who told it like it was, who was faithful to God in his charge of bringing messages to God's people. But now, on the very heels of this incredible thing that took place there on Mount Carmel, now he's afraid. Now he's afraid. And I believe that that tells us that perhaps he was spiritually depleted. That maybe he wasn't the same man now that he was just a little while before, in the sense that he was afraid of Jezebel. He wasn't afraid of Ahab, but you see, Jezebel was more real to Elijah now than God was. He went in the strength and in the power and in the encouragement and in following after the will of God. He confronted Ahab and all the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, and God was very big to him, just as God was very big to all the people of Israel. The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God. But now, all of a sudden, God's not so clear in Elijah's mind. God's not so near to him. Rather, instead, Jezebel has caused him to be afraid. And I have this picture here of the fire coming down out of heaven to consume that offering that Elijah made. And I suspect that Elijah wasn't afraid of anything at that particular moment. I suspect that at that moment, Elijah was indeed filled with courage, filled with his responsibility to God. And we see that being carried out in that he destroyed the false prophets of Baal. You see, that's one of the problems about discouragement, and that's one of the things that is problematic about, especially if you get all the way to the point of where that you're depressed, that you're pressed down, is that it hides God from you. God's not so real. God's not so close. God's not so powerful. The Lord is not that real to us. The fact of the matter is, Elijah had a real zeal for God. He even said that, I have been very zealous for the Lord. But after Jezebel sent a message to him that I'm going to kill you, all of a sudden that zeal is not to be found. He runs away. Rather than confront her as he did her husband Ahab, he runs away in fear. And I think it would be important for us to kind of consider a couple of things that made such a drastic change in Elijah. For one thing, he had a misplaced focus. Our focus is to be upon God. God is our help. God is our strength. He's a very present help in the time of trouble, as we mentioned this morning. He is the one who has promised that he will not leave us nor forsake us. Jesus promised his apostles as they went out on the Great Commission, and is true for you and me, lo, I'm with you always. And yet, Elijah has lost sight of that, and his focus was all wrong. He said, for the sons of Israel has forsaken your covenant. And as we'll see in just a moment, he's thinking, I'm the only one left. One of the easiest things, ladies and gentlemen, one of the easiest ways to begin to become discouraged is to focus too much on what's going on around about you. It really is. We all love one another and appreciate one another because we're all brothers and sisters in Christ. And we have a love and appreciation for one another because we have been called out from the world into the marvelous light of the gospel of Jesus Christ, and we all have a love for God that the people of the world do not have, and we really love and appreciate one another. But you know what? If we start paying really close attention, we start focusing on the foibles of one another, the next thing you know, we're going to start being discouraged, because you know what? We're all going to disappoint one another sooner or later. We really are. That's the reason why the Hebrew writer tells us that all of those folks mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11 were witnesses to us. Witnesses to the fact that we can have the kind of faith that they had. And that we can do the same kind of incredible things in service to God that they did. They are witness to us that just you and me, common folk, can have the kind of faith that Abraham had, and Moses had, and David had. Because I think sometimes it's really hard for us to really believe that we can successfully follow in the footsteps of Jesus. He was the perfect Son of God. Now, trying to follow Moses and trying to follow Abraham, and even thinking about New Testament folks like Peter and Paul and folks like that, we can kind of identify with them a little bit better. But we sometimes just want to pay more attention, don't we, to the folks that we read about in Hebrews chapter 11. But you know, it's interesting to me at least that those folks are held up as witnesses. But the very next verse tells us that we are to keep our eye on Jesus, because he's our example. Because he's perfect. He committed no sin. He never did anything wrong. He never disappointed a single person. He was all exactly what he was supposed to be, the sinless Son of God. And we need to focus our attention on Jesus Christ. And I get disturbed sometimes. I was attending a gospel meeting in Illinois, and I went out after the gospel meeting with some of the folks that were in attendance there to a local restaurant to have some coffee afterwards. And one of the brothers that was there with us got to talking about how that he was starting to get discouraged from the standpoint that it just didn't seem like the folks of the congregation where he worshiped was really all that enthusiastic about serving God. And he went on and on and on about little things that needed to be done in the congregation there that weren't getting done because nobody would do it. And I told him, I said, "You're scaring me." He said, "Really?" And I said, "Yes, you are. You're scaring me because what I see here is you focusing on people. People who are imperfect, just like you are imperfect." I want to make sure that he understood that somebody was watching him as well, you know. And if we just focus our attention on one another, yeah, we're going to be discouraged because we're going to disappoint one another. Sooner or later, we're going to find something. As incredible as it might seem, we might find something wrong with Tom sitting over there. But we will, sooner or later. But we will not by focusing on Jesus Christ. We need to keep our focus on Him. And it seems like that sometimes we get more in tune with what people are or are not doing than what we really should. And that's very similar as we focus on folks. But one of the interesting passages of Scripture to me is John chapter 21. You remember after Jesus had been raised from the dead, He appeared to His disciples, and it wasn't going to be long before He was going to ascend back into the heavens. And He had this occasion to speak with Peter. And He kept asking Peter, "Do you love me?" And Peter kept saying, "Well, Lord, you know that I love you." Now, I find that very interesting, by the way, because it hadn't been just too very long ago that he had denied Christ 3 times, just like he said he would, before the cock crew. And Jesus asked him, "Peter, do you love me?" And he says, "Yes, Lord, you know I love you." And he asked him a second time, and it seems like that Peter was getting just a little bit cranky about it, if you ask me. He said, "Well, Lord, you know I do. I think if it had been me, I'd have spoke up about that time. Well, what about that denial thing? You know, what do you mean I know you do?" But that wasn't what Jesus did. He asked him a third time, "Do you love me?" And he said, "Yes, Lord, I love you." And then it wasn't long after that, after Jesus kept telling him, "Feed my sheep," that we read this from John chapter 1, how that Peter, turning around, saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them, the one who had also leaned back on his bosom at the supper and said, "Lord, who is the one who betrays you?" So Peter, seeing him, said to Jesus, "Lord, and what about this man?" Jesus said to him, "If I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me." Therefore the saying went out among the brethren that the disciple would not die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he would not die, but only, "If I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you?" I think that it's interesting that God repeated that part of it. Because Peter looked back and there he saw John, the disciple that Jesus loved, and he said, "Well, Lord, now you want me to feed you, well, what's John going to do?" And Jesus basically said, "What's it to you?" That's really, when you look at it, that's what Jesus said, "What's it to you?" What if I don't want him to do anything? What if I want him to just go over there and sit on a stump for the rest of the time and just absolutely do nothing? What's that got to do with you feeding my sheep? And the implication is it has absolutely nothing to do with it. And when you get right down to it, brethren, one of the really good things, I think it's a positive thing, is it doesn't really make any difference if Bruce is doing everything that he's supposed to be doing. It's not all that critical as far as my salvation if someone is not doing everything that I at least think they ought to be doing. And part of the problem is that right there. We have a tendency to kind of legislate responsibility. I do know this, that if we keep our eyes on one another, we're going to be discouraged because we're going to disappoint one another from time to time. And if we focus upon what everybody else is doing as opposed to what I'm supposed to be doing, God's given me a responsibility according to my ability. One of the wonderful thoughts that Paul wrote to Timothy about is, "I have finished my course." I don't have to follow around Bruce and do everything that he does. What God has given me to do is entirely different than what God has given Bruce to do. And what I have to do is I just have to be faithful to the Lord concerning what He has given me the ability to do. And so it is with each and every one of us. And I think that that's a wonderful thing. I think that's a great blessing. I think that's a very positive thing. And we can turn that positive thing into a negative thing if we keep watching one another and being critical about whether or not we're all doing what we're supposed to be doing. And that's what the problem was with Elijah here. He was focused on the wrong thing. He had in his head, he was the only one in Israel that was faithful to the Lord. He had a Lone Ranger complex. We mentioned that this morning, but that's exactly what the problem was. He said, I alone am left. Well, that wasn't right. That wasn't true. And I think that really when you get right down to it, when we start getting discouraged and when we start getting to the point where we're feeling depressed and we start making these accusations, I am all alone, I think we're insulting God. Matter of fact, I know we are because He's promised us He will never leave us or forsake us. And so it was necessary for God to rescue Elijah. He needed to do something for this guy, and he needed to do it real quick. And one of the things that he did, as we read about it in 1 Kings chapter 19, he lay down and slept under a juniper tree. You remember, he went up there to Bathsheba, and he lay down and he slept under a juniper tree, and behold, there was an angel touching him, and he said to him, arise, eat. Then he looked, and behold, there was at his head a bread cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. So he ate and drank and lay down again. And the angel of the Lord came again the second time and touched him and said, arise, eat, because the journey is too great for you. So he arose and ate and drank and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights before the mountain of God. Notice that his instruction was to arise and eat. You know, psychologists tell us that one of the things that happens when we start suffering from depression is we begin to neglect just the physical necessities as far as keeping our bodies healthy. We don't sleep correctly. We don't get enough sleep. We deny ourselves the kind of rest that we need. We oftentimes will not even eat like we're supposed to. And there's a direct connection between our good physical health and our emotional well-being. And one of the things that God tells us, and as I said at the beginning, you would expect for God's Word to let us know how we can deal with some of these things. And God tells us a very practical thing here. And He says one thing is if you are being discouraged, if something has happened to you and you're just feeling down and out and you're not yourself, first of all, don't neglect the physical aspects of your body as far as eating and getting good rest and that sort of thing. My daddy died at the age of 76. And I never will forget when the doctors came and told us there's just nothing. The only thing that will keep your dad alive is for him to have a heart transplant. And my daddy, when the doctor made that offer and told him that, my dad's response was, nope, going out with the original equipment. So he wouldn't allow them to do a heart transplant. But the problem was that about 4 or 5 years before, my dad had a heart attack. He suffered a heart attack one day at work. And he just got in the car and he drove home. It wasn't a real major heart attack. I mean, it wasn't, a catastrophic kind of heart attack, but he definitely had a heart attack. He just got in the car, drove home, and he stayed in bed a couple of days, and then he went back to work. And the doctors told us that, it's unfortunate because if he had come into the hospital and let us treat him, probably he cut his life short by maybe 3 or 4 years by not tending to it like he should have. And God created us. He knows what we need. And one of the things that God tells us, just as a practical application, is take care of yourself physically. Get the kind of rest that you need and eat the kind of food that you need in order for your health to continue on. Don't neglect yourself. We also see how that God revealed Himself to Elijah. So He said, go forth and stand on the mountain before the Lord, and behold, the Lord was passing by. I love this part here. The Lord was passing by, and a great and strong wind was rending the mountains and breaking in pieces the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of a gentle blowing. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle, went out and stood in the entrance of the cave, and behold, a voice came to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Now what is really, I think, important for us to get from this is that God does not always demonstrate himself in some outlandish way. As a matter of fact, for you and me today, that's just not going to happen too much. He's not going to manifest himself to us today like he used to in days gone by. But he's still near. Because when he spoke to Elijah, he asked him, "What are you doing here?" And to me, that word simply indicates that God was right there with him. He didn't say, "Elijah, what you doing over there in that cave anyway?" He just asked him, "What are you doing here?" And I know that he was telling him that he had work for him to do, but I think that it does bring to our mind what I've been saying so much today as far as dealing with being discouraged, is that we cannot lose sight of the fact that God is here with us. He's right here. And that's, I think, perhaps the strongest element of his encouragement to us that we have, that we need to really focus on. And so God had to change Elijah's perspective, and he says, I alone am left. And God said, "Well, you know, I will leave 7,000 there for all the knees that have not bowed to Baal. You're not the Lone Ranger. You're not alone, not even by a long shot. There's 7,000 in Israel that have not bowed the knee to Baal. You just haven't been looking in the right spots, I guess." But he had to change his perspective. And then God gave Elijah a helper, and his name was Elisha. We talked about that this morning. How that God did the same thing for Moses. He gave him those 70 men to help judge over and to deal with the complaints and all the murmuring of the people. I think that if there's anything that I would like for us to really benefit from as far as this study today concerning discouragement and even depression, is to realize how important we are to one another. We are the support group that God has given us to deal with life. People of the world have to pay money and go see psychologists and psychiatrists and want to fill them full of pills that make them feel worse and all that kind of stuff. And they don't really deal with the root of the problem. And the root of the problem, ladies and gentlemen, is when we are walking faithfully with God, closely with Him. He's there. And we know He's there. And He helps us get through day by day. And He has given us this wonderful support group called the church that we can be a part of so that we can help one another. This evening, again, we just want to ask, do you need some help? Because at some time or another, all of us do. Do you need some help? Are you going through some things that we really don't know anything about? And again, as I mentioned this morning, sometimes it can be embarrassing as far as asking for help for some specific things, but that's a whole lot better than having to bear the burden all by ourselves when God has made it possible for us to lay our cares upon Him and to have one another bear our burdens with us. Again this evening, if you need help, the Lord is here, and we are here to help you. And we would like to have you let us know if you need some help. All together, we stand and sing.